Hey friends. Tonight, we're stepping softly into a chapter of history where silence was survival, and suspicion was a sentence. Not a world of sails or sabers, but of flickering candles, damp stone, and questions whispered a little too loudly. These were the witch trials of 15th century Germany. A time when winter came early, bread spoiled quickly, and the devil, people believed, could be hiding behind any familiar face. There were no broomsticks, no bubbling cauldrons. Just ink-stained hands, trembling testimonies, and the slow machinery of justice that thought itself divine. Forget the bonfires of later centuries for a moment. Before Salem, before sensationalism, there were villages where midwives, widows, and healers were quietly unmade by rumor. Their judges? Pious men with heavy books. Their crime? Being remembered too vividly, or not enough. Welcome to Sleepful History, where we explore the past and just enough curiosity to carry you gently into sleep. If you enjoy these quiet wanderings through history, don't forget to like the video, but only if it truly helps you rest. And drop a comment to tell me where you're tuning in from, and maybe what time sleep found you tonight. It's always lovely to see this quiet little coven of listeners from across the world. Now take a deep breath. Let the hush of your room become the hush of an old wooden chamber. Let the creak of your mattress become the creak of a church pew. Close your eyes, or keep them half-lidded, and picture the faint glow of a torch-lit corridor, and someone waiting at the end, holding a question they already think they know the answer to. Tonight, we walk into the shadows of the witch trials, and their story is just beginning. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that you are born in a small village in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire, roughly sometime around the year 1470. It's not a famous place. It has no grand cathedrals, no printing presses, no statues of emperors or martyrs. What it has is pigs, and cold winds, and people who notice things they probably shouldn't. You, specifically, are a woman. Or at least, you have been born female, which means the story already has some unfortunate foreshadowing. It also means that your job in life, assigned without ceremony, is to obey, to serve, to endure, and to stay quietly useful until the day you stop being one of those things. You were not born into wealth. You were not born into nobility. You do not own land. You do not read Latin. You have never seen the inside of a university, or a monastery, or even a proper kitchen with more than 2 cooking pots. But you have learned how to grind herbs with a stone bowl, how to dry nettle without losing too many fingers to its sting, and how to mix the soot from your fireplace with animal fat to make a kind of soap that burns if it gets in your eyes but still smells slightly better than nothing. You live in a home that is more suggestion than structure. Its walls are made of wattle and daub, wood and latticework packed with mud, straw, and hope, and the roof is thatch that leaks at 3 different points when the spring rains arrive. The door is held together by iron nails that someone else hammered in before you were born, and the hearth is just a hole in the ground with rocks around it, where you do your cooking, your warming, and most of your regretting. Your mattress is straw stuffed into a bag made from an old grain sack, and the straw must be changed regularly, or else you risk welcoming fleas, mice, or something worse. Your pillow, if it can be called that, is a bundle of fabric scraps tied with twine. There is no privacy. There are no locks. The sound of wind comes through the walls as if the house itself is breathing. You wear a woolen tunic, which you have patched 13 times and dyed once with onion skins, hoping to mask the stains from the last several winters. Your shoes are made of leather, if you are lucky, or of scraps of cloth wrapped tightly around your feet and tied with twine, if you are not. In winter you wrap your legs with rags and say a prayer to Saint Apollonia, not because she's the patron saint of warmth, she isn't, but because you once heard her name while someone survived a fever, and that's as good a reason as any. And now, winter has arrived again. You wake in the dark. There is no clock to tell you the time, but the chill has crept through your clothing and touched your spine like a bony hand. Your fire has gone out. It always does. No one has yet figured out how to make fire last through a 15-hour night when the only fuel you have is damp wood and dried cow dung. You curl up tighter, press your hands under your armpits, and wait for the gray light of morning to leak through the door's gap. When it does, it brings no comfort. Just another day of wet shoes, cracking skin, and thin gruel. Your tasks begin immediately. There are no weekends. No holidays unless the church says so, and even then, you're usually working harder, because God has a way of making rest more complicated than labor. You check on your goat, if you still have one. Goats are excellent at dying when you can least afford it. You pour what little grain you have into a wooden bowl, sniff it for mold, and hope that your neighbor doesn't borrow from your garden again. Your fingers are always stiff. Always. You've not known what it is to wake without pain in your knuckles since you turned 30. Or was it 28? You forget. There are no birthdays here. Just seasons, and the seasons don't remember you either. Some days you walk to the forest. Not far, just far enough to collect kindling, or maybe some mushrooms, or nettle if the sun has warmed the soil enough. You know which plants sting, which heal, and which are better left alone. You know because your grandmother told you, and she knew because hers did. But lately, knowledge has become dangerous. Someone saw you gathering flowers last week. They were purple. Pretty. But someone said they smelled strange, and now people are looking at you a little longer than before. You are, they say, peculiar. You live alone. You don't come to church every Sunday. You sometimes hum to yourself while you cook. You once helped a woman give birth when the priest was away, and the baby lived, even though the mother didn't. That baby is now 6 and has a limp. People talk. You did nothing wrong. You have never cursed anyone. You have never danced under the moon. You do not own a grimoire. But you also don't know how to make people comfortable. And in a village this small, comfort is everything. People here live pressed up against one another, not physically, but spiritually. They know each other's habits, sins, grudges, and petty weaknesses. They know who didn't return a borrowed tool. Who's been secretly watering their turnips at night. Who might have once kissed someone before marriage. It is a system of constant watching, constant measuring. And when something goes wrong, a death, a drought, a stillborn child, the system needs an explanation, and lately, that explanation has been circling around you. The priest has noticed. He does not say your name, not yet. But he has begun preaching sermons about temptation. About women who stray from the path. About Eve, and about the devil. His eyes scan the congregation when he says these things. Sometimes they land on you. Sometimes they don't. But you feel them either way. There is no defense against this kind of danger. Because it is not based on action. It is based on narrative. On who fits the story best. And you fit it far too well. Spring, when it comes, is not a celebration. It is a test. The thaw turns the roads to mud. The rivers swell and then recede, leaving behind debris, stink, and sometimes bones. You plant with trembling hands, hoping the seeds you bartered in February haven't gone stale. You patch your roof again. The wind has peeled another strip from it. And as the birds return, so do the rumors. A cow miscarried in the next hamlet. Someone's milk turned sour overnight. A traveler spoke of witches in Würzburg, and someone remembers, casually, that your chimney smokes too early in the morning. By summer, the ground hardens, and so does everyone's suspicion. The sun heats the thatch until it smells of straw and mice. You wake with sweat in your hair and nothing in your stomach. The goat gives less milk now. Your knees ache more. And that boy with the limp? He fell from a ladder. He says it was the wind, but his mother says he cried your name in his sleep. You go to the well less often. You avoid eye contact. You hear snickers behind your back, and once you find a small wooden cross left at your doorstep. You do not touch it. Autumn brings the harvest, thin and bitter. The apples are riddled with worms. The wheat is short. Someone saw a raven perch on your roof and call 3 times. No one likes that. You bury your herb jars in the garden. You stop singing while you cook. You skip Massachusetts not because you're guilty, because you're afraid. Winter is a return to silence. Everything slows. The world becomes sharp with cold. Ice gathers at the edges of the windows, where there are windows, and the fire must be tended hourly or else it dies, and you with it. Your bones are stiff. The floor is hard. The roof creaks with snow, but even in winter the church is loud. The priest has taken to reading from a new book, one sent from another town, bound in dark leather, filled with Latin and warnings. He reads about Sabbaths, about women who fly, about potions and animals who speak at night. He speaks of signs, birthmarks, extra nipples, skin that doesn't bleed. The villagers nod. They look around. They begin to remember. You once helped the miller's daughter when she was ill. She got better, but her hair never grew back the same. You once told the blacksmith his son would be born early. He was. You once said the weather would change, and it did. Too many coincidences. You are, perhaps, just a little too aware of the world. The fear in 15th century Germany is not of magic. It is of imbalance. Of a world gone crooked. The plague still haunts memory. Famine comes every 10 years, if not 5. Wars flicker in and out like brush fire. The devil, people say, walks in plain clothes, speaks softly, whispers not into king's ears, but neighbors, and sometimes, that devil chooses a woman who lives alone. They begin asking questions. Not formally, not yet. They never start that way. It begins with curiosity. Did you see her last Sunday? Has she been to confession? Did she really go into the forest alone? Then come the warnings. Someone says you should be watched. That it's for your own good. That they care about your soul. Then one morning the knock comes. Not a banging, not at first. Just a knock. Courteous. Cold. A man from the church, a deacon maybe, with his hands clasped and his eyes down. He asks if he might speak with you. You say yes. You always say yes. Because saying no is worse. He asks about your prayers. Your habits. Whether you sleep well. Whether you dream. Whether you've ever had cause to feel tempted. You answer carefully. He thanks you. He leaves. You do not sleep that night. Days pass. Or maybe weeks. No one speaks to you. No one looks at you directly. But you see how they cross themselves when you walk past. You see the children pulled back by their mothers. You find one of your chickens dead, and its feet tied together. You hear scratching beneath your floorboards. You stop lighting your fire before dawn. You are already guilty. They are just waiting for the paperwork. There is a word they use, hex, and though it has changed in meaning over the centuries, in your time, it means one thing: woman plus fear. Woman plus knowledge. Woman plus survival. And you know too well, survival is suspicious. You are not special. You are not alone. There are others, women like you. Some younger. Some older. Some with husbands. Some with none. Some beautiful. Some plain. Some with herbs in their cupboards. Some with only bread. But all of them have that same look in their eyes. The look of someone who knows they are being watched. Let us take a closer look, not at her history, but at a single day. The sun is still an hour below the horizon when she wakes. Not because she wants to, but because her back has seized, her ankles ache, and the cold is licking at her neck like something alive. The fire has died. Again. She knows she should have fed it more in the night, but sleep was too thin and her bones too heavy. She does not rise immediately. First, she listens. For wind. For movement. For anything that might signal trouble. Then, slowly, she sits up, pulling the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her joints pop. The straw beneath her rustles with things best not considered. The air is damp. It always is. The cottage sits low in the ground, where moisture gathers and refuses to leave. The thatch drips in 3 steady rhythms, one above the hearth, one near the door, and one, annoyingly, directly into a shallow pan that she must empty every morning. She stands, wraps her feet with cloth, ties them with cord, and feels the cold reach through anyway. She moves toward the hearth. The ashes are still warm. With care, she stirs them, hoping for a live ember. She finds one barely. She adds dry moss and a splinter of kindling. Breathes gently. Coaxes flame like an apology. It takes 10 minutes to light enough fire to warm a pot of water. She pours in what little she has from the clay jug beside her bed. The water smells faintly of iron. The well hasn't been cleaned in months, and she no longer has the nerve to ask the men of the village for help. While it heats, she gathers her things: a slice of old bread, dried until it cracks when bent, and a smear of lard. It is not a meal. It is a memory of one. She eats it slowly, staring into the fire, feeling the bread scratch her throat and the fat cling to her teeth. There is no table. She eats on a stool. There is no chair. There are only places to sit that are slightly less uncomfortable than the floor. When the water begins to steam, she uses some to wash her face. There is no mirror. Just a dented pewter plate. Her reflection is cloudy, distorted. She sees the lines, the shadow beneath her eyes, the uneven color in her cheeks. She sees the mole near her ear. It has always been there. But lately, it feels more like evidence. She dresses fully now. The same wool tunic. The same patched apron. A scarf tied over her hair. She steps outside, into the gray light of a fogged morning, and breathes in the smell of smoke, wet wood, and something vaguely sour that might be coming from the neighbor's pigsty. She walks to the goat pen. One goat remains. The others died last winter. This one, greedy, stubborn, prone to kicking, at least produces milk. When it feels like it. Today, it does not. She curses under her breath, then bites her tongue. Words are dangerous. Even in private. She returns to the house, sets the empty pail beside the door, and begins sorting through her stores. A handful of dried beans. A jar of pickled cabbage. A cracked pot with sour barley stew clinging to its rim. Enough, perhaps, to last another 3 days. If she were someone else, someone married, someone more liked, she might ask for help, but she isn't. Instead, she checks the herbs drying by the hearth. Most are limp, their color faded. But a few have kept their scent. She crumbles some rosemary into a pouch, adds mint, and a pinch of crushed bark, something her grandmother once called feverwood, though she has no idea what it's called in Latin, or whether it's legal. Not that legality means much here. What matters is appearance. She tucks the pouch into her apron, ties it tight, and steps out again, this time to visit the sick woman at the far end of the village. Not out of obligation. Not for money. Just because no one else will. The walk is long, and the road is little more than a path worn down by centuries of repetition. Mud squelches underfoot. Birds call from the trees, shrill, uncertain notes that remind her how empty everything feels this time of year. When she arrives, the door is already open. The woman lies on a straw mat, pale, sweating. Her husband watches her from a distance, arms folded, distrust thick on his brow. He does not speak. She kneels beside the sick woman. She checks her pulse, her breath. She touches her forehead. Too warm. She reaches into her pouch, prepares a mix of herbs, and asks for boiled water. The man hesitates, then obeys. She makes a tea. She pours it slowly. She helps the woman drink. Then she stays for a moment. Just enough to see her breathing ease. When she leaves, the man does not thank her, but she hears him whisper something to a neighbor as she passes, something that begins with which. She does not look back. The days pass, and so does time, though she barely feels the difference anymore. Morning arrives like a shrug, night falls like a curtain. The in-between is filled with things to do, but never quite enough to keep the thoughts at bay. She begins to pray more often, though it brings no peace. The prayers are old ones, learned by repetition, not faith. Pater Noster, Kyes and Kalis. Her Latin is broken, mumbled, filled with gaps. She whispers them anyway, because silence is worse. Silence means thinking. And thinking, now, is a dangerous habit. She prays not for mercy, but for obscurity. To be forgotten. To be invisible. To be just another figure in the mist. At night, she lies awake long after the fire dies. The sounds of the forest press close, branches cracking, owls calling, the distant thud of something large and unseen. Her roof shifts with the weight of ice. Her walls creak as if they are breathing. Sometimes she hears footsteps that aren't there. Sometimes she thinks she sees faces in the wood grain. She doesn't believe in demons. But she believes in people. And people are far more dangerous. She remembers her grandmother's house, now long gone, and the strange little item she used to keep near the door. A string of dried nettle. A carved figure, worn smooth by time. A lump of wax pressed with a coin. She never explained them. But she always touched them before stepping outside. She remembers her mother's stories, half warning, half lullaby, about women turned into birds, or cursed to walk in shadows, or swallowed by the woods. None ended well. She does not tell stories. She listens. She listens when the baker's wife complains of stomach pain. When the smith's apprentice says he saw a crow that didn't fly away. When the children say they found footprints in the snow, too large to be human, but walking upright. These things aren't evidence. But they are seeds. And seeds, given the right soil, grow into fires. She begins hiding things. Not because they are magical, but because they are misunderstood. A jar of dried fungus. A scrap of parchment with symbols she copied long ago, not knowing what they meant. A ribbon from a woman she once loved and never spoke of again. She buries them beneath the floor. One morning, she finds a circle drawn in ash near her doorstep. She does not know who placed it there. She does not disturb it. She steps over it with care, and later sweeps it away. By now, the village has turned polite. Which is worse? People nod but do not speak. They watch but do not approach. They do not ask for help. They do not bring bread. They do not say her name. She is becoming a story. It is not a loud process. It is a slow erosion. A retreat from daily life. First from invitations. Then from favors. Then from speech. Then from space. One night she attends Massachusetts. She sits in the back. She does not sing. She does not kneel. She does not go to confession. And when the priest speaks of sin and temptation and women who whisper to the moon, he looks over her head, but just barely. She walks home in the dark, alone, with every crunch of snow beneath her feet sounding like a warning. And still, no one has accused her. Not officially. But the air has changed. She feels it. In how the chickens avoid her yard. In how the cats disappear. In how the wind shifts just before sunset. In how the sky stays gray even when there should be stars. She dreams of fire. Not warmth, but flame. Tall, bright, roaring. She is standing at its edge, and though her feet are bare, the ground beneath them is not cold. In her dream, she does not scream. She stands. She watches. She does not wake in terror. Only exhaustion. She wakes the same way every morning now, with breath held tight in her chest, and a knot in her stomach that no food can undo. The body knows before the mind does. And hers is telling her the end is close. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon. There will be a knock. There will be a question. There will be no right answer. Because once someone believes you are dangerous, everything you do becomes evidence. Your silence becomes secrecy. Your kindness becomes manipulation. Your illness becomes a trick. Your recovery becomes unnatural. And when that moment comes, when the priest arrives not with a deacon but with 2 men from the next town, armed with rope and a list of names, she will not scream. She will not run. She will nod. Because she has been waiting for this. For weeks. For months. For years. She knows how this story goes. She has seen it before. A woman older than her, once. A child with strange eyes. A man who carved charms into wood and gave them away for free. None of them returned. And she will not either. Not because she is a witch. But because someone needs to be. She begins to keep track of the calendar, not by dates, but by saints. Saint Agnes comes with the frost, and the priest tells the villagers to cleanse their homes of impure thoughts. Saint Blaise brings the blessing of throats, but also the memory of choking, of children who never cried again after fever. Saint Walpurga, whose name whispers like smoke, comes in spring, and her feast is always a little too joyful, a little too nervous, as though people are celebrating survival rather than grace. Every Sunday, the sermon grows darker. The priest reads more frequently from new texts, ones that speak not of mercy, but of vigilance, of devils in women's skin, of Satan's pacts written in blood, of signs, subtle and scattered, that mark the chosen of hell. The people nod. They begin watching again. This time, not with curiosity, but with resolve. She spends her days cleaning things that are already clean. She resweeps her floor. She scrubs her pots until the metal shows. She hangs herbs upside down and replaces them every few days, even if they haven't spoiled. She lights candles. She crosses herself more than necessary. None of it helps. Because belief, once formed, requires no proof. She tries to remember the last time someone touched her hand. It might have been a child. A woman in labor. A neighbor, before the whispers began. Now, even when she passes the baker's coins to pay for flour, he lets them drop into her palm like he's avoiding a flame. The absence of touch becomes its own kind of branding. Her prayers change. They are no longer requests. They are negotiations. Bargains. She offers promises. If I survive this month, I will give up my herbs. If I am spared the trial, I will walk to the shrine barefoot in winter. If no one accuses me, I will live in silence forever. The heavens do not answer, but the wind does. It moans around the corners of her house, squeezes through cracks in the shutters, and tugs at the cloth she uses to cover her face when she sleeps. It rattles the pan on the roof. It whistles through the keyhole, even though her door has no lock. Sometimes she dreams of running. Not far. Just to the forest. Just to vanish. To walk and never come back. But she knows that fleeing would confirm the story. And so she stays. She begins eating less, not from piety, but from nausea. Her stomach, once strong, now turns at every meal. Her mouth is dry. Her fingers tremble. She talks to herself. Quietly. As if testing the shape of words that no one else will hear. She repeats names, not of saints, but of people she once trusted. People who now cross the street to avoid her. She wonders how many would testify. How many would claim they saw her walking at night. How many would say her eyes glowed. She wonders how many would need to say it before the fire was lit. She wonders if, in some part of her, she might start to believe them. That is the final cruelty. Not the rope. Not the cold. Not even the flames. But the moment, just before the end, when you begin to think, perhaps they are right. Perhaps I am not as innocent as I believed. Perhaps something inside me has become unclean. This is how you die in the 15th century. You do not bleed. You dissolve. In whispers. In looks. In sermons. In fear. You become an outline of a woman, filled in with someone else's nightmares. And no one, not the priest, not the neighbor, not the sky, will lift a finger. Because you have been made into a symbol. And symbols, once lit, burn very well. In the town of Dillingen, nestled along the Danube in southern Germany, the late 16th century arrived like a stiff wind, quiet at first, but quick to grow sharp. This was not yet the age of fire and mass executions. But the kindling had already been laid. By 1587, the fields around the town were patchy with hunger. The harvest had failed more than once in recent years. Livestock disease passed through the countryside like a curse, thinning herds and shriveling family wealth. The 30 Years' War was still decades away, but the air already smelled of instability, of threats not yet named. And in times of uncertainty, the human mind, ever hungry for cause, turns inward. In Dillingen, a midwife named Walpurga Hausmännin had worked for years among the poor and the anxious. She had helped deliver babies, comforted women after miscarriage, and applied poultices to festering wounds with the quiet skill of one whose knowledge came from generations of oral memory. She was not formally trained, no woman of her class could be, but she was trusted, in the strange, conditional way that healers often are. They are needed, even welcomed, until the day they are feared. No one knows exactly when the whispers began. Perhaps it was after a child died during delivery. Or perhaps it was when someone mentioned that Walpurga had predicted a storm. Or perhaps it was because of the simple, unspoken fact that she lived too long. In those days, a woman past 40 without a husband could only be one of two things: pitiful or suspicious. And Walpurga was not pitiful. What is known is this: in the summer of 1587, she was accused of witchcraft. The charge came not from a single source, but from a pattern, a gathering of grievances, suspicions, and anecdotal evidence that, when held up to the candlelight of public fear, glowed just enough to be dangerous. She was arrested quietly. There was no mob, no shouting. Just a knock at her door and a request to come with the officials. It was said she complied calmly, perhaps even with a kind of resignation. That, too, would later be interpreted as unnatural. Guilt, they said, had made her bold. The chamber where she was kept was stone-walled, windowless, and thick with damp. The air inside smelled of mold and iron and something sour beneath it all: despair, perhaps, or the sweat of earlier confessions. She was given food, but not enough to be full. She was given water, but not always clean. She was given time. Time to think, to question, to begin the slow, downward spiral toward the place where truth and memory separate. The interrogation began after 2 days. The officials were learned men, some secular, some of the church. They carried books. They used Latin terms, not for precision, but for distance. They asked her about her habits, her patience, her dreams. They asked about animals, about herbs, about bleeding practices, about anything, really, that could be twisted into a suggestion of unnatural power. At first, she denied everything. Not with fire, but with calm disbelief. No, she said, she had never attended a Sabbath. No, she had never cursed a child. No, she had never made ointment from unholy things. No, she had never known the devil, in dream or in flesh. But denials are fragile under pressure, and pressure was precisely the point. They tied her thumbs until her knuckles turned white. They pressed her with questions faster than she could answer. They deprived her of sleep. They forced her to stand until her legs buckled. They promised that confession would bring mercy. That denial would only prolong suffering. It worked. It always worked. On the 4th day, her first confession came. It was small, simple. She said she had once spoken aloud to her cat, and it had answered her in a language she could not understand. That was enough to begin. The next day, the questions turned sharper. They wanted names. They wanted stories. They wanted detail. And so, she gave it. She said she had been visited by a man in black, who offered her knowledge and warmth. She said she had danced in the woods with others, whose faces she could not name. She said she had flown, not by broom, but by wind, through the sky toward a distant fire. She said she had signed a book, though she could not read. She said the devil had kissed her left shoulder, where now there was a mark. They checked. They found a freckle. It was enough. But confession alone did not satisfy the machinery. They wanted more. They wanted to confirm their suspicions, to justify the process, to extend it outward. Walpurga, now broken in body and mind, began to supply names. Women she had worked beside. Women she had once envied. Women she barely knew. She told the men what they wanted to hear. That the children who died had been sacrificed. That the potions she mixed were made with grave dirt and ground bones. That she had spoiled the communion wafers in a chapel years ago. That she had stolen consecrated oil and poured it into the river to summon spirits. These stories, born of exhaustion, pain, and fear, became her reality, and once confessed, there was no path back. The trial, when it came, was no more than performance. The outcome had been decided long before the first question was asked in public. The town square was swept in the early morning, though the dirt returned before midday. People gathered slowly, with the same kind of quiet anticipation one might feel before a storm or a sermon. They did not bring torches. They did not shout. They simply watched. Some came because they believed in justice. Others came because they were afraid not to. But most came for the same reason people have always come to these things, because the fire was someone else's. Walpurga was led into the courtroom by two men, one on either side. Her hands were bound, not cruelly, but tightly. Her head was bare. Her face, observers later wrote, was unreadable. Not defiant. Not pleading. Merely blank, as if something behind her eyes had gone quiet. The judges sat at the front of the room, behind a table carved with religious symbols. They wore robes, and spoke in turns, each reading from scrolls or books or official letters. The charges were read aloud, slowly, clearly, in the language of the people, hexerai. Witchcraft. The evidence was her confession. The confession was the result of interrogation. The interrogation was justified by the suspicion, and the suspicion began with a whisper. Witnesses were called, not to prove, but to affirm. A woman spoke of a child who had wasted away after Walpurga delivered it. A man remembered seeing her carry something wrapped in cloth into the forest. Another claimed he had once found a dead bird near her door and took it as a sign. Each story was ordinary, disconnected. Together they formed a net from which she could not escape. She did not speak in her defense. She was not asked to. Her words were no longer hers. They belonged to the record, the confession, the machinery that had already decided what they meant. The verdict was unanimous. She was guilty of witchcraft, of consorting with the devil, of murder by magical means, and of sacrilege. The sentence, death by fire. But not immediately. There was ritual to observe. The church required her to be offered one last chance at repentance. And so she was taken back to her cell. A priest was sent to speak with her. He carried a small cross, a vial of oil, and a voice full of compassion sharpened by duty. It is not known what passed between them. Some say she repented. Others claim she stayed silent. Still others insist she smiled and spoke in tongues. But the truth is likely less dramatic. She was tired. Her body bruised, her mind hollowed. Whatever words she gave, they were likely meant for no one but herself. The execution was scheduled for dawn. That night, the town slept uneasily. Fires burned low in their hearths. Mothers checked on their children twice. A dog howled at nothing. And in the church, a bell rang once, soft, long, like breath through wood. The next morning was cold. The sky was pale, washed out, either cloudy nor clear. The wind came low across the Danube, pushing smoke from chimneys sideways. A pyre had been built in the square, dry wood stacked around a post, ropes coiled neatly, a bucket of water placed nearby, not for mercy, but for spectacle. The town stood in a loose semicircle, avoiding eye contact. She was brought out just as the sun touched the horizon. Her walk to the stake was slow, not because she resisted, but because her feet were bare, and the frost bit deep. Her hands were tied before her, her tunic plain, her face unreadable. Children clung to mothers. Some men removed their hats. The priest read a final prayer. She was offered water. She declined. She was bound to the post, her arms drawn behind her, her body held upright not by strength, but by rope. The wood crackled beneath her feet, and then the torch. It was touched to the edge of the pile, low, where the wind could carry the flame upward. There was no announcement. No drum. Just the sound of fire catching, of branches popping, of straw collapsing into coal. She made no sound, or perhaps the sound was too small to carry. The fire rose. Smoke wrapped around her legs first, then her chest. Her head tilted back. Some said she whispered. Some said she chanted. Some said her mouth moved with no sound at all. Within minutes she was gone. The fire burned for hours. Long after her body had turned to ash, the townspeople remained. Not to celebrate. Not to mourn. But because leaving too soon felt impolite. By midday, the square was empty again, and Walpurga Hausmännin had vanished, not just from the world, but from its memory. The ash cooled. Wine scattered it before noon, and the townspeople pretended not to notice when flecks of char stuck to their boots or caught in the wool of their sleeves. The stake remained upright until the evening, blackened but intact, a quiet marker of what had happened and a warning of what might. No one cleaned the square. That, too, was part of the ritual. By the next day, life resumed. Bakers opened their shutters. The priest gave a shorter sermon than usual. Children played again in the alleyways, avoiding the scorched patch in the center of the square with a curious sort of reverence. Some people crossed themselves when they passed it. Others did not. In the records of the town, the entry was brief. Walpurga Hausmännin, executed by fire for crimes of witchcraft and consorting with the devil, as confessed under examination. May her soul be judged by the Lord. No mention was made of her work as a midwife. No mention of the babies she helped deliver safely. No mention of the women who once smiled at her in gratitude. She had been removed, completely, not just from life, but from community, from memory, from belonging. And in her place was silence. But this silence had a strange quality. It was not peace. It was suspension. Because even as the town resumed its routines, even as bread rose and bells rang and carts creaked down the road, something had shifted. A precedent had been set. A line had been crossed, and then forgotten, and in forgetting, made permanent. And that's where the story of Walpurga becomes something larger, because she was not the first, and certainly not the last. In the years that followed, others would be accused. Some were healers like her. Some were simply unlucky. A widow who quarreled too loudly with a neighbor. A merchant's wife whose husband fell ill. A child who drew shapes in the dirt and didn't speak for 3 days. Each time, the process repeated. The quiet rumor. The isolated questioning. The withdrawal of community. The summons. The cell. The confession. The fire. And with each repetition, the machinery grew more efficient. The procedures were refined. New manuals were written. Clergy were trained in identifying signs. Torture instruments were standardized. Records were kept, neatly, carefully, as if to prove that this was not madness, but order. This was how societies purged, not with clarity, but with ritual, not with justice, but with symmetry. Someone must be blamed, or the fear will eat everyone. And so, the fear is given a body. A name. A story. A pyre. And the people sleep a little easier that night. What makes Walpurga's story so unsettling, so deeply exhausting, is not the extremity of it. It is its ordinariness. There was no great drama. No trial with shouts and rebellion. No miracles. No final act of defiance. Just a woman, folded gently into the shape her town required her to be. There are places, buried in legal records, half-faded on parchment, where her words still exist. Her confession, copied in the stiff Latin of clerks who didn't know her, becomes the only version of her voice that survives. We don't know what she loved. We don't know what made her laugh. We don't know whether she cried, or if she whispered to herself to stay calm, or if she looked to the sky one last time and thought of a field she once walked through as a girl. We only know what she was made to say. And in that, she becomes a kind of echo. A voice used not to speak, but to fill silence. A figure not remembered but recorded. A name that flickers only briefly in the margins of history, and then disappears. And that is why it is so easy to repeat. Beck. To understand how a woman like Walpurga became firewood for the conscience of her village, one must look at the world she lived in, not only the walls of her cell, but the structures far beyond it. Because this was not a mistake of a single community. It was a design. A framework. And she was simply the part of it that happened to crack. In 15th and 16th century Germany, the boundaries of power were shifting. The church was splintering, caught between the growing force of Protestantism and the slow decline of Catholic dominance. The Holy Roman Empire was not a country but a patchwork of princes, bishoprics, free cities, rural villages, and autonomous regions, each with its own laws, customs, and tensions, and everywhere fear. Fear of the devil. Fear of sin. Fear of failing crops and sick cattle and cold summers. Fear of female knowledge. Fear of the unknown. fear of the familiar turned strange. Walpurga lived in a world where survival was a group effort, where isolation was deadly, and where belonging was a currency far more valuable than reason. Those who didn't belong, women without husbands, healers who worked outside church-sanctioned medicine, widows with strong opinions, midwives with too much experience, were easy to mark. Their usefulness could become a threat, their presence a question, their skill a sign. In this environment, the act of accusation became more than just a personal grievance, it became a form of alignment. To accuse was to protect oneself. To observe was to participate in collective safety. To stay silent was to invite scrutiny. And so, the mechanisms evolved. No single law required witches to be burned, but enough allowed it. The Carolina Code of 1532, though it came after Walpurga's death, codified torture and execution as legal methods in cases of sorcery. Earlier than that, many areas relied on older canon law, supported by local tradition and theological writings, some of them newly printed and freshly feared. Men like Heinrich Kramer, who authored Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, gave intellectual weight to these rituals. He taught that witches were real, common, and irredeemable. That their crime was spiritual, not criminal. That women, by nature, were more susceptible to the devil. That confession was not only proof, but salvation. His book became a guide, not just to identify witches, but to build a system around their destruction. In such a system, the truth is irrelevant. All that matters is coherence. And Walpurga fit the shape of what people needed to see. It is tempting to view her story as something ancient, outdated, safely past. But the architecture remains. The speed at which people assign blame, the quiet power of rumor, the comfort of believing that evil has a face, and that it is not ours. These things did not burn with her. They linger. In language. In the quiet places of the human mind, where fear is not a shadow but a seed. Walpurga Hausmännin died centuries ago. But her trial is still being repeated, in new forms, with new words, by new judges. And the flame, though less visible, still glows. There is a kind of magic that doesn't feel like magic. It smells like mildew. It hides behind rafters. It cracks beneath floorboards when you walk too hard across the room. It doesn't sparkle. It doesn't chant. It waits. In 15th-century Germany, people believed in miracles and demons, in relics and saints, in omens, curses, and small gods that lived inside the woodshed. But most of all, they believed in signs. Not signs like symbols on paper or carvings on doors, though they had those too, but signs in the everyday. A candle that wouldn't light. Milk that curdled too quickly. A dream that came twice. A shadow that moved where it shouldn't. None of these things were strange by themselves, but when placed beside each other, like pins in a cloth, they created a pattern. And patterns meant trouble. So people fought back. Not with swords, but with bottles. They made them from ceramic or glass, or sometimes reused old pots, the ones too cracked for food. Into them went the tools of unseen war. Urine, mostly, because it was yours, and witches couldn't hurt what was claimed. Rusty nails, because they stabbed invisible things. Bits of thread, salt, bits of iron, slivers of bone, and hair, always hair. The bottle would be stoppered, buried near a door or hearth, sometimes beneath the bed. It was never meant to be seen again. Its power came from its hiding. Modern archaeology calls them witch bottles. But back then, they weren't called anything at all. They were just necessary. Like locks on doors. Like prayers before sleep. Like garlic hung above the cradle. They weren't about belief. They were about fear. Fear had a shape, and it lived inside the walls. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it. You could feel it in the way a fire flickered when there was no breeze. In the way your mother's hands trembled when she salted meat. In the way your father spoke too softly when he mentioned the woods. In the way a cat watched corners. In the way your grandmother muttered under her breath while tying herbs in bundles of 3. The world was full of entrances. Windows, doorways, chimneys, cracks in the stone, gaps beneath the door. Spirits liked these places. Curses traveled through them. Nightmares too. So people blocked them. They wedged brooms against thresholds. They poured salt on sills. They hung iron horseshoes above beds. They burned ash branches on Midsummer's Eve. Not for show. Not for beauty. For survival. Sometimes they hid shoes inside the walls. Not pairs. Just one. Always worn. Always hidden. Shoes carried something of the wearer, a scent, a weight, a memory. Spirits didn't like shoes. Maybe because they couldn't wear them. Maybe because they were too human. They also buried hearts. Sometimes of pigs. Sometimes of cows. Once, even a dog. Pierced through with nails. Wrapped in cloth. Sealed in boxes. Tucked into the foundation. When a barn caught fire or a fever moved too fast, people looked for blame. And when they couldn't find it outside, they looked beneath their own homes. None of this was written down. Not in recipe books. Not in church records. This wasn't heresy. But it wasn't doctrine either. It was older than both. Older than Rome. Older than Christ. Older than language. It was inheritance. It was protection. It was insurance against a world that didn't care whether you lived or died, only that you performed the right gestures before doing either. Women knew these things best. Not because they were witches, but because they were watchers. They watched over children, over fields, over sick animals, over dying husbands. They remembered the combinations of bark and leaf. They whispered prayers that were half Christian, half forgotten. They made dolls out of wax and stuck pins in them, not to harm, but to hold. To carry the pain away. To focus the fear into something they could bury. The church didn't approve. But it didn't always interfere. Not unless someone spoke too loudly. Not unless something failed. A failed charm was suspicious. A working charm was dangerous. Either one, if seen by the wrong eyes, could become a trial. So people kept quiet. Even now, centuries later, the traces remain. In the corners of old houses. In the gaps beneath thresholds. In the soot-blackened spaces between beams. Archaeologists find the remnants. A bottle here. A shoe there. A poppet made of straw. A pendant carved from bone. Sometimes, even an old Bible page, folded into a triangle, ink worn away, placed under a hearthstone. They try to reconstruct the purpose. To chart the rituals. To name what was never named. But what they find isn't religion. And it isn't science. It's something in between. It's fear made solid. Fear with nails in it. Not all magic was condemned. Not all witches were feared. There were lines, often unspoken, that separated the helpful from the harmful. A woman who brewed tea for fevers was wise. A woman whose tea worked too well was suspicious. A man who read the stars was clever. A man who predicted a death was dangerous. The same act, seen through different eyes, could be called healing or heresy. It all depended on the outcome. If the sick recovered, it was God's will. If they died, it was yours. White magic, they called it sometimes, though never in public. It was not written into laws or catechisms. But it existed, tolerated in whispers. It was the magic of protection, of healing, of warding off harm. Mothers used it. Midwives, especially. They knew which flowers bloomed under moonlight, which stones hummed in your palm, which prayers to say backwards if a child refused to breathe. Black magic, on the other hand, required no proof. Only discomfort. Only coincidence. It was the magic of suspicion. Of silence. Of things that went wrong. The difference was rarely about the ritual itself. It was about the person who performed it. Their status. Their timing. Their gender. Their age. Their friends. Their enemies. An old woman with too many cats might be called a witch. A young woman with no children might be called barren. A rich man who donated to the church might be called generous. A poor man who spoke too confidently might be called cursed. It was never just about belief. It was about control. These bottles, these charms, these hidden shoes and pierced hearts, they were tools of the powerless. Not to dominate but to endure. To make sense of a world that killed without reason. A world where plagues came in waves. Where children disappeared in the woods. Where thunder struck the same field twice. Where bread turned black. Where neighbors turned strange. People didn't expect protection to be perfect. They only needed to feel they had done something, that they had tried. That they had buried the right things, tied the right knots, burned the right herbs. That they had made the signs and whispered the words and placed the bowl of salt just so. That they had created a barrier, however fragile, between themselves and whatever wanted in. The magic wasn't in the objects. It was in the ritual. In the repetition. In the rhythm. A bottle hidden beneath the door didn't stop a curse. But it made the door feel safer. And that feeling was often enough. It made sleep possible. It made guilt manageable. It made grief seem less random. And in that sense, it worked. It was not unlike prayer. Or medicine. Or poetry. It was the quiet belief that symbols had weight. That intention mattered. That the world responded, however subtly, to the shapes people made in it. Of course, not everyone approved. The church tolerated some of it, until it didn't. Tolerance was thin, and it could evaporate overnight. One edict from a bishop. One letter from a noble. One new priest with ideas about fire and sin and the devil's many disguises, and suddenly the bottle beneath the hearth was not a charm, but evidence. Suddenly, what had been invisible became criminal, and yet people still buried them, even knowing the risk, even knowing the cost. Because the fear of being cursed was greater than the fear of being caught. Because it was better to risk damnation than to do nothing. Because, deep down, no one truly believed the world was neutral. The world of the villagers was small. Not just in distance, but in imagination. The horizon was the forest. The clock was the sun. The law was the priest. What lay beyond the next hill was not curiosity. It was danger. In that world, knowledge was both precious and perilous. Knowing too much could save a life. Or cost yours. A woman who knew how to stop a bleeding wound was a treasure, until the day someone decided she caused the bleeding to begin with. So most people didn't speak. They practiced their rites in silence. They handed down recipes in hushed tones. They showed a daughter how to dry elderflower with a thread, how to bury a bone to seal a promise, how to sew a red thread into a dress hem to confuse wandering spirits. These weren't spells. They weren't rebellion. They were tools of emotional survival. A grammar of caution. And in every house, there was a space for it. A box. A beam. A corner of the hearth that never got scrubbed. A hollow brick. Sometimes a small bag behind the door, tied with 3 knots, filled with salt and hair, and something that smelled faintly of fennel. People didn't explain these things. They just knew not to move them. The homes themselves became protective charms. Built low to the ground, with beams from trees felled under moonlight. Doors hung to the east. Salt lines drawn just beneath the threshold before the first fire was lit. Not everyone followed these rules. But those who did didn't talk about it. Saying the reason aloud would make it too real. There's a kind of safety in secrecy. That's why these bottles were buried, not displayed. They were deliberately hidden. They weren't meant to be seen by friends, or enemies, or even the people who placed them there. Once hidden, they became part of the house. Part of its bones. A silent contract. I have made the effort. I have given the offering. Now please leave me alone, and it worked, sometimes. Just enough to believe. Just enough to keep doing it. When a sickness passed by one hoe. And more than that, it was personal. The church offered protection, too, through relics, prayers, confession. But it was abstract. Institutional. Cold. It came through intermediaries. A bottle beneath the hearth, on the other hand, came from your own hands. From your own fear. From your own blood, if necessary. It was intimacy, not dogma. It was something you could touch. Of course, that intimacy made it dangerous. Because if it worked, it must be real. And if it was real, it must be from somewhere. And if it wasn't from God, then it had only one other possible source. That was the logic of the time. Narrow. Absolute. No room for duality. No space for ambiguity. Either you were protected by the church, or you were protected by something else, and that something else, by definition, was evil, even if it saved your child, even if it stopped the bleeding, even if it helped you sleep at night, especially then. They called them charms, but they were not beautiful. There was no silver thread, no polished stones, no graceful symbols drawn in ink. These objects were crude, nails turned brown with rust, scraps of woolen thread stiff with damp, bits of bone or wood, often unmarked, always unglamorous. They weren't made to be admired. They were made to be buried. Because power in that world came not from glory, but from obscurity. Beneath the floorboards of simple cottages, in the walls behind hearths, inside cracked foundations or behind loose bricks in the chimney, people left these offerings, not to invite anything in, but to keep something out. Their magic wasn't a request. It was a warning, a defense. A wall drawn not in stone, but in intent. And they did not speak of these things. Not even among family. Because silence was part of the spell. To speak of protection was to acknowledge danger. And in a world where saying the wrong thing could earn you suspicion, people learned that the safest magic was the quiet kind, the one that worked without notice, the kind that disappeared the moment it was made. Those who lived in fear of spirits weren't fools. They weren't uneducated. They weren't backward. They were practical. They had seen too much go wrong too suddenly. A healthy child coughing blood. A fire that started with no spark. A cow that looked you in the eye and then collapsed by dawn. These things weren't just misfortune. They were breaches. Fault lines in the invisible fabric that held the world together. And to ignore them was to invite more. So, they watched the moon. They hung iron by the door. They kept sharp things in places no one could see. They never gave bread with the left hand. They never spoke a blessing after sundown. And when someone died, they opened the windows, so the soul could find its way out before the air soured. These rituals weren't written. They didn't belong to religion. They belonged to memory, to repetition, to rhythm. 1,000 small gestures passed down like recipes, barely explained, never questioned. And in those gestures was safety, or at least the feeling of it. What made them fragile wasn't that they failed. What made them fragile was that they worked, sometimes. Just enough. Just often enough to become habit. Just effectively enough to become sacred. But sacred things draw attention. And attention, in a suspicious world, is never neutral. The church watched these customs from a distance, rarely speaking until it had to. For a time, small rituals were tolerated, especially when they didn't contradict doctrine too openly. A pouch of dried herbs above a cradle could be seen as quaint. A prayer murmured in dialect might be excused as a relic of rural life. But there was always a line, thin, flexible, but dangerous, and when crossed, it snapped back with violence. It was not the object that caused alarm, but the context. It wasn't the bundle of hair beneath the doorstep. It was the timing. If someone got sick. If someone died. If someone dreamt badly and woke speaking your name. Then the harmless bundle became a threat, a sign, a symbol of something larger. People learned to live on the edge of that line. They whispered when the wind was loud. They buried their bottles deeper. They made sure their rituals were never too precise. Too precise meant intent. And intent meant blame. It was easier when these habits were vague. When a charm could be dismissed as superstition. When a pattern could be called coincidence. But the moment something worked too clearly, the moment someone said aloud that they had been spared by a buried nail or a protective stone, the ritual changed. It became evidence. It became something that had to be explained. And in 15th-century Germany, explanations were not your ally. The church preferred clean boundaries. Saints on one side. Demons on the other. And yet the world people lived in was made entirely of gray spaces, moments where folklore and liturgy bled together, where a holy water font sat beside a carved token, where a crucifix hung above a doorway that had been washed 3 times with water from the first spring rain. It was not contradiction. It was survival. A theology built not in cathedrals but in kitchens. Not on parchment, but in gesture. And most who practiced these customs never called them magic. They were habits. Inherited responses to old fears. They were done because mothers had done them. Because grandmothers had done them. Because not doing them felt like an invitation to misfortune. There was no ideology in it. Only memory. Only repetition. Only the quiet promise. If I do this, maybe nothing will happen. But nothing was never guaranteed. And when something did happen, an illness, a fire, a miscarriage, then everything was reconsidered. Especially by neighbors. Especially if you were strange. If your eyes were too sharp. If your tongue was too fast. If you walked with too much certainty or not enough. If you lived too long or too alone. Then your quiet habits, harmless last week, became sinister. Then your buried bottle became a plot. Then your shoe in the chimney became a curse. This was not logic. It was pattern seeking at the edge of desperation, and it was deadly. Even the most devout homes had their secrets. The priest's cottage, with its whitewashed walls and carefully aligned crucifixes, was not immune to the quiet rituals of the countryside. His mother had tucked sprigs of rowan above the lintel. His sister had once buried a lock of her child's hair in the garden after a fever passed. And though he might preach against such things on Sundays, he never quite asked where the second broom had gone when the last one snapped in winter. It was easier not to know. Easier to let tradition nest in the corners, so long as it didn't speak too loudly. The merchants were no different. Behind the coins and contracts, behind the imported fabric and salted fish, they too carried their own fears. A trader might wear a small pouch beneath his tunic, stitched shut with waxed thread, filled with ash and thistle, meant to ward off betrayal. His wife might scatter dried beans across the doorway on the first morning of the new year. These weren't spells. Not to them. They were custom. Old ways. And if you asked them about it directly, they'd laugh. Or frown. Or change the subject. Because the power of these practices came not just from belief, but from secrecy. Once made public, they unraveled. And in that unraveling came judgment. So people held tightly to silence. They nodded politely when the priest condemned folk magic. They burned their incense quietly, out of sight. They crushed dried yarrow in the mortar before dawn, and swept the remains into the hearth before the household stirred. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't pride. It was necessity, quiet, persistent, unspoken. This was not the kind of magic that wore robes or lit candles in the forest. It did not chant. It did not fly. It did not seek attention. Its practitioners were not witches in the stories. They were neighbors, mothers, servants, bakers. They walked with you to market. They prayed beside you in church. They buried charms in their walls and then forgot where they'd placed them. And when a neighbor burned, they watched in silence, knowing that the bottle beneath their own bed might one day be found. And no one thought it would happen to them, but everyone feared it could. That's why these rituals mattered. Not because they held real power in the eyes of the powerful, but because they were one of the only powers the powerless had. A way to push back, gently, invisibly, against the grinding weight of hunger, death, and chance. They could not control the weather. They could not stop a plague. But they could tie 9 knots in a length of wool, whisper a name with each loop, and tuck it beneath a stone near the door, and for one more night they could sleep. It was never the charm itself that burned. It was the suggestion it carried. The bottle beneath the hearth never spoke, but others did. A neighbor with a grudge. A child repeating what they didn't understand. A priest convinced that every sickness had a name, and every name must be recorded. The object remained still, silent, forgotten. But in the right, or wrong, hands, it became louder than words. That's how fear works. It fills in gaps. It makes assumptions. It stitches stories from fragments, from gesture, from the ordinary. It doesn't need proof. It only needs timing, and the worst timing was always after something went wrong. A cow dies. A child falls ill. A fire begins without warning. The wind moans for 2 nights. The bread won't rise. Someone dreams of teeth. Someone else finds a feather on their doorstep. And somewhere in all of this, someone remembers that you hung a pouch above your door last year. That you crushed something into powder. That your mother never took communion. That's how the line shifts. One moment you are simply cautious. The next you are accused. And what was once protection becomes confession. The very things that gave you comfort, the bottle, the shoe, the hidden thread, become reasons for exile. Or worse. And this is perhaps the cruelest truth at the heart of it all. The most dangerous signs of witchcraft were usually the ones meant to protect. A bottle placed with trembling hands beneath the floor, filled with hopes of warding off evil, would, one day, be pulled out and held aloft as proof of it. The charm would be dusted, weighed, inspected, catalogued. Its materials, iron, bone, thread, would be named. Its maker would not. They wouldn't ask why it was buried. They'd only ask who buried it, and that question never ended well. So the bottles became rarer. The shoes fewer. The gestures smaller. People still practiced, but carefully. Quietly. Secretly. Some let the old ways die. Others held on to them, not out of rebellion, but remembrance. Because memory lives in the hands. In the movements. In the quiet shape of repetition. Even when words are forbidden. That's why, when archaeologists dig today beneath old homes and chapels, they sometimes find those same tokens. Blackened bottles. Shoes sealed in walls. Tiny pouches filled with dust and stones and meaning. Not because someone tried to curse the world, but because someone once tried to survive it. They weren't witches. Not in the way stories tell it. They were people. Afraid. Practical. Devoted. And somewhere between prayer and panic, they made something with their hands and tucked it out of sight. And for a while, that was enough. They didn't look like monsters. They didn't wear black. They didn't cackle, or vanish, or whisper to the moon. In fact, they rarely whispered at all. Their voices were clear, firm, public. Their clothing was neat. They carried not daggers but documents. Their power didn't flicker like candlelight. It sat heavy, square, deliberate. You didn't see them until it was too late. And even then, you didn't see fire. You saw ink. You saw wax seals. You saw the cold stillness of a man who believed he was doing God's work. They were called inquisitors, or judges, or notaries. Sometimes commissioners. Occasionally just the learned men. They didn't arrive with curses. They arrived with questions, and they asked them well. Witch hunters weren't born. They were shaped by famine, by failure, by fear. They were usually men of uncertain beginnings, often from families with little land and less status. They were clever, not noble, devout, not serene. Many had studied, though not always to the end. They had read Latin, or at least pretended to. They knew how to copy a sentence without error. They knew how to speak slowly. How to cite a source. How to stand when others bent. They had ambition. But not power. Not yet. That's where the devil came in. Because when the world trembles, when crops fail, when children die, when milk turns to blood and the sky refuses to rain, someone must be blamed. And that blame needs a voice. A structure. A procedure. And that procedure needs someone to lead it. The witch hunter was not the enemy of the people. He was their function. Their mirror. Their answer. He rose from their need. He did not shout. He gathered. He compiled. He listened, closely, patiently, to stories told half in fear, half in resentment. He took names. He noticed patterns. He called it proof, and when the stories became too many to ignore, he acted, not with rage, but with ritual. That was his gift. He made violence feel like order. He was not a priest, but he wore the robes of piety. He was not a judge, but he knew the forms. He was not a soldier, yet his words marched forward with the weight of swords. The witch hunter moved between roles, not because he was deceitful, but because the system needed him to, because the church needed a hand that could act while it looked away, and the people needed a voice that could speak their panic aloud in the language of authority. He did not arrive with torches. He arrived with Malleus Maleficarum, tucked in his bag like scripture, its pages already creased from repeated use, its margins marked with annotations, some his own, others passed from hand to hand, like sacred graffiti. It was not just a book. It was a ladder. It told him not only how to ask, but how to hear. What to look for. What not to forgive. He was trained, not in kindness, not in doubt, but in system. He had read that women were weaker, more susceptible to sin, that their dreams were porous, their flesh corrupted by lunar tides and sensual imbalances. He had read that Satan spoke not in roars but in whispers, and that the first signs of witchcraft were not cauldrons or cats, but defiance. A woman who did not bow. A midwife who refused to explain a death. A widow who smiled when she should have grieved. He carried these thoughts like tools, and he used them not recklessly, but with care. Because to accuse too broadly was to lose control. The village might revolt. The clergy might distance themselves. But to accuse too little was to be forgotten. He needed rhythm. He needed escalation. A few small cases, at first. A confession gained. A name whispered. Then another. A child's testimony. A pattern. And once the pattern formed, he no longer had to prove it. It proved itself. Each cry confirmed the last. Each execution quieted doubt for a moment. And when doubt returned, he had charts, and ink, and stories from other towns. He had numbers. He had diagrams of circles found in soot, of wounds shaped like pentagrams, of dried poppies sewn into pillows. He showed them, and people nodded, and fear became obedience. And in the silence between questions, he listened to the hum of his own importance, growing louder with every answer no one dared contradict. He traveled often, not with an army, but with letters. His satchel carried no charms, only credentials, a seal from a bishop, a signature from a magistrate, a folded piece of parchment authorizing him to ask questions in the name of God and law. That was all he needed. Doors opened. Tables were set. Rooms were prepared in the homes of clerks and wealthy families. Those who wished to be seen as loyal and faithful, those who feared being the next name in a stranger's inquiry. He did not pay for his meals. They were offered. Not out of generosity, but insurance. No one wanted to seem distant from righteousness. So they welcomed him, listened to his stories of heresy in nearby towns, nodded gravely when he described the signs, the muttered prayers, the stiffened cows, the children with blackened tongues. They asked questions. They offered rumors. They opened their ledgers, their memories, their neighbors, and he noted everything. In the quiet of night, he sat by candlelight, quill in hand, and wrote, not poetry, not confession, but patterns. He drew names into diagrams, traced lines between family disputes and harvest failures, mapped gossip like geography. This one lost a child last winter. That one refused a suitor. This one sold herbs too cheaply. That one was seen walking barefoot too early. He did not believe in coincidence. He believed in connections. And when there were none, he built them. He did not shout. He arranged. That was his gift. Where others saw a grieving woman or an eccentric herbalist, he saw a node, something central, something dangerous. And once he saw it, he could not unsee it. It lodged in his mind like a splinter, and every refusal to confess only drove it deeper. He was not cruel, not at first. He asked softly. He waited. But when the answers didn't come, he pressed harder. And when pain began, it was not rage that drove him, it was ritual. The rack, the boot, the iron tongs, none of these were improvised. They were prescribed, detailed, authorized. He had read the manuals. He had memorized the thresholds. He knew how much pain could be given before a confession became invalid. He believed, or told himself he believed, that the body's screams were the devil's last grip on the soul, and that each cry was a step towards salvation. So he listened, and when, at last, the words came, staggered, exhausted, desperate, he nodded not in triumph, but in confirmation. The devil had been named, order could be restored, and he, once more, had done his duty. The danger was never in the flames. It was in the quiet that followed. That stillness, that fragile order restored after the smoke cleared and the ashes were swept away, was addictive. Because in that silence, the witch hunter stood not as a man who had inflicted pain, but as one who had removed a threat. He was not the cause of the screams, he was the one who had stopped them. This is what he told himself. This is what others told him, and belief, when echoed enough, becomes fact. He began to walk differently. Not arrogantly, never openly, but with a slowness, a certainty, that belonged to someone whose place in the world was no longer questioned. When he spoke, people listened. When he entered a room, the air shifted. When he touched a document, others leaned in. He no longer had to prove himself. He had done that in fire. But what he never said, even to himself, was that he had begun to need the next name. The next town. The next doubt to chase. Because in stillness, the questions crept in. Had that woman truly cursed her neighbor, or merely spoken too freely? Was the child's fever born of devilry, or disease? Was the mark on the thigh a pact, or a mole? And why, in the moment before the confession, had he flinched? He never let these questions settle. He moved forward. Always, because movement meant purpose, and purpose silenced reflection. There were always new towns, always new murmurs, always another priest with a troubled conscience, another merchant with a vendetta, another village split by rumor and fear. He became known, not feared, not hated, but respected. The way one respects a storm. With distance. With reverence. With silent hopes that it will pass elsewhere. And the witch hunter began to believe not only in witches, but in himself. In the idea that he had been chosen. That his ability to see what others overlooked, to extract truth from agony, to organize chaos into testimony, was not a profession, but a calling. He prayed. Not for mercy, but for clarity. He asked for discernment, for fortitude, for the wisdom to separate shadow from truth. And when answers came, they often looked exactly like his own suspicions. That was enough. So he continued. Through spring rains and autumn frost, through plague and famine and war, he moved from town to town like a slow fire. Not because he hated, but because he believed. And belief, pure, burning, unchallenged, is the sharpest blade of all. They did not cheer for him. Not openly. Not often. But they did not oppose him either. That was his power, the space between applause and protest, the uneasy quiet that followed his arrival, like wind before a storm. No one wanted to welcome a witch hunter, not in public. Yet no one wanted to be seen not welcoming him either. So they offered him lodging. Warm bread. Clean sheets. They nodded during his sermons. They whispered when he passed, and they watched. Because in truth, most of them believed. Or wanted to. Or needed to, because the alternative, that the world was cruel for no reason, that children died without cause, that cows withered because of drought and not design, was more terrifying than any pact with the devil. So they listened when he spoke of signs. They pointed quietly at neighbors who brewed too often, walked too far, said too little. They did not shout accusations, but they allowed them. They fed the fire not with kindling, but with silence. And when he knocked on their doors, they offered names. Not always with malice. Sometimes with hesitation. Sometimes with genuine fear. Sometimes because they could not explain what had happened, and he could, and an explanation, no matter how cruel, is often kinder than chaos. Some doubted. Quietly. They watched their neighbors dragged from homes and wondered if the devil truly danced in their cellars, or if perhaps they had merely been unlucky. But they said nothing. Because those who doubted aloud often found themselves questioned. And a question, in the hands of a man like him, could become a sentence. Others believed too much. They came to him with long stories, with breathless rumors, with lists of names. They brought him dried herbs, bent pins, small dolls with missing limbs. They told him of dreams, of animals behaving strangely, of milk curdling at sunset. They wanted to help, or be seen helping, or prove that they were righteous. And he listened, not because he trusted them, but because he understood. Fear is a kind of fuel. It burns whether true or not. So he took their words, sifted them, cross-referenced them, recorded them in his ledger. And the ones that fit his pattern he kept. The rest he let dissolve. He knew that too much noise could blur the shape of guilt. He needed clarity, not chaos. Or at least, the appearance of it. And the people, for the most part, accepted this. Not with joy, but with something colder, reluctant relief. Because even if he was wrong, even if he burned the wrong woman or interrogated the wrong child, the mere act of doing something, anything, made the world feel manageable again. And that, in the end, was his greatest spell. Not torment, not testimony, but order. There were nights, not often, but real, when he sat alone by candlelight, long after the confessions had been inked, after the fire had died, after the names had been struck through with thick black lines, and something stirred at the edge of his certainty, not regret, not even guilt, but something more delicate, more dangerous, doubt. It crept not in words, but in sensations, a tightness in the chest, a dryness in the throat, the sudden sharp memory of a glance, a scream, a silence that had lasted too long. He did not speak of these moments. He did not record them. They were not data. They had no place in the ledgers. But they lingered. He remembered the woman who did not cry, not even once. The child who answered too quickly. The man who confessed everything before a single question had been asked. These fragments lodged in the corners of his mind like splinters in a wooden chair, too small to remove, too deep to forget. But doubt, when isolated, is weak. And he had armor. He had the church. He had the printed word. He had the memory of towns saved, of outbreaks stopped, of fields that bloomed after a burning. He had the gratitude of priests, the approval of bishops, the reverence of those who feared him. These were not illusions, they were structure. And structure can drown doubt like stone over water. So he repeated to himself the teachings. The devil is cunning. The guilty often appear innocent. The tongue lies, the eyes deceive, but pain reveals. He recited them not aloud, but in the rhythm of his thoughts, like a drum beneath his decisions. And each time he did, the doubt receded, not gone, but contained, because to admit error once, even quietly, was to invite it everywhere, and he could not afford that. His reputation had grown. His name moved faster than his feet. Towns prepared for him weeks before he arrived. Letters preceded him. Requests. Warnings. Gratitude. Fear. And in this wait he found purpose again. A flawed man might question. A chosen one must persist. So he did. He turned the page. Inked the next line. Lit another candle. And when he closed his eyes he prayed, not for mercy, but for resolve. Because he could not stop now. To stop would be to see, and he had come too far for vision. In the end, it was not one man, not one name, not one tribunal, or one heretic, or one pamphlet that set it all aflame. It was the system itself, a slow, tangled vine of fears and half-truths, of books written in cloisters and rumors passed in market stalls, of sermons built on scripture and gossip dressed as law. The witch hunts were not a moment. They were a machine. And like all machines, they worked because no single cog believed itself responsible. The judges said they followed evidence. The priests said they followed scripture. The hunters said they followed both. And the people, they followed silence. It was not hatred that fueled the fire, but momentum, the grinding certainty that if nothing was done, something worse would happen. So action became obligation. Accusation became duty. Torture became ritual. And fire became cleansing. The machine was self-sustaining. It needed only three things: fear, authority, and the absence of interruption, and those were always in abundance. Fear came from droughts, from dead livestock, from failed births and frostbitten wheat. Authority came from books, from bishops, from documents penned in long-dead Latin and stamped with red wax. And interruption, resistance, came from nowhere, Because who would defend a witch? Who would speak when speech risked fire? Even those who knew, those who watched too closely, who saw the patterns, who heard the same confessions copied word for word across counties, they said nothing. Or they wrote in code. Or they kept diaries and prayed they would not be found. Because the machine did not stop for the sake of reason. It stopped only when it ran out of fuel, and even then, it smoldered. It left behind ashes that whispered. Whole villages lost their women. Families disappeared. Fields lay fallow because the hands that once tilled them had burned. And still, some said it was necessary. That the devil had been strong. That God had required sacrifice. That sin could not be reasoned with. That's the hardest part to understand. Not the pain, not the death, but the sincerity. Because most of them believed they were doing right. And when belief wears a robe and holds a ledger, when it speaks in the language of institutions and moves at the pace of bureaucracy, it is almost impossible to stop, not because it is hidden, but because it is respected. That, in the end, is what made the witch hunter so dangerous, not his cruelty, not his ignorance, but his conviction. It did not take magic to avoid being burned. It took property. It took connections. It took the right kind of silence, and sometimes, the right kind of noise, measured, rehearsed, spoken in Latin. In the 15th century, the devil was not blind, but he was oddly selective. He seemed to haunt poor women more than wealthy men. He visited lonely midwives more often than notaries. He rarely, if ever, knocked at the door of someone who had a library. In the cities, in the well-kept houses behind carved doors and iron locks, there were charms too. But they looked different. They wore the clothes of religion. There were Bibles placed deliberately at thresholds. Not to be read, but to be seen. There were crucifixes polished to brightness, oil lamps that burned at dusk even when no one needed light. There were relics, fingers of saints sealed in glass, feathers said to be from angels, bones wrapped in velvet, purchased not from monks, but from merchants who understood the value of holiness as a commodity. These were not the tokens of superstition. These were status, and status could be a shield. When a nobleman's daughter dreamed of a black dog and fell into fits, no one burned the nobleman. They summoned a physician, then a priest, then, sometimes, a scholar. When a widow with no land saw the same dog, they summoned a rope. This was not hypocrisy. It was hierarchy. The church, though vast, was not uniform. In some towns, the local clergy held power through fear. In others, they deferred to secular judges. In others still, the bishop's word carried weight, but only if the local magistrate allowed it. Law, like truth, was a matter of geography, but wealth traveled. And those who had it could send letters. They could pay for advocates. They could donate to the cathedral. They could host visiting officials. They could, when pressed, disappear for a few weeks, perhaps to visit a cousin, or to pray at a distant shrine, and return only after the fire had cooled. They knew how to speak. They knew what not to say. They had books that explained the boundaries. They had servants to take the blame. They had witnesses to swear they were elsewhere. They had priests who had baptized their children. They had records. And they had time. A poor woman accused of witchcraft had none of these things. She had no land to bargain with. No letters of introduction. No Latin. No coin. No network. She had only her silence. And silence, in court, is never neutral. The law, on parchment, promised order. But in practice, it was language. Those who knew how to shape it, slowly, strategically, and in the right dialect, could often reshape their fate. Words, when chosen well, moved differently than fire. They smoldered. They waited. They persuaded. In the courts of larger towns, the trials of witches did not always begin with pitchforks. They began with documents. With complaints, signatures, dates, titles. A woman with nothing to her name could be accused with a whisper. But a woman whose husband once sat on the city council required more. She required structure, and structure favored the educated. An advocate, hired at just the right moment, might argue that the symptoms were natural, that the witness was unreliable, That the accused had no history of subversion, no record of sacrilege, no unusual scars or marks. He might quote Augustine or Aquinas. He might cite inconsistencies in the accusation. He might raise his voice slightly in just the right places. And the judges, who had heard too many cries and not enough calm, might listen. They wouldn't say it aloud, of course. But they understood what he was doing. He was providing an exit, an off-ramp from escalation. Because trials, especially ones involving witchcraft, were dangerous not only for the accused, but for the town itself. The more attention it drew, the more pressure mounted. From above. From bishops. From neighboring jurisdictions. From those who asked too many questions. So sometimes, it was better to end it quietly. Fine. A short penance. A quiet departure. A note in the record, case closed for lack of evidence. That is how the rich survived, not by denying the system, but by understanding where it preferred silence. They knew how to speak in ways that were acceptable. That sounded pious. That allowed others to back away without losing face. It wasn't about innocence. It was about plausibility. About familiarity. About giving the judges something easier than condemnation. Because even a judge, no matter how devout, no matter how brutal, preferred not to light the fire unless he had to. So when a man with lands was accused, he came not with pleading, but with paper. Not with herbs, but with titles. Not with sweat, but with ink. He presented his case not in emotion, but in citations. And in doing so, he reminded the court that the fire could wait. That perhaps there was another explanation. That perhaps this was simply a misunderstanding, and if he paid enough, it often was. There were homes where the walls bore not herbs but hymns. Where prayers were painted into the plaster. Where saints gazed down from woodcuts hung between polished brass crosses. And in these homes, magic was not practiced, it was displaced. It was something that lived outside, in other houses, on other streets, in places where the floorboards sagged and the chimney leaked and the people prayed in whispers. In the homes of the wealthy, there were books. Not just Bibles, but books of hours, illuminated manuscripts filled with saints and angels and golden vines that wrapped around the margins like threads of safety. These books were not often read. But they were shown. To visitors. To priests. To officials. They were placed in view. They were handled with reverence. They were protection not for the soul, but for the reputation. A prayer book meant literacy. It meant Catholic devotion. Or Lutheran, depending on the province. It meant alignment with the proper forces, the proper authorities, the proper version of heaven, and then there were relics. Small bones sealed in glass. Pieces of cloth said to be from holy robes. A drop of blood dried on parchment. They were purchased, usually, from traveling monks. Sometimes from merchants. Sometimes from people who didn't say where they got them. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that they existed. That they could be held up in moments of doubt. That they could be pressed into a judge's hand, or better, into his memory. These objects did not ward off spirits. They warded off suspicion. To own them was to say, I am one of you. I believe. I fear the devil too. But he is not in my house, and it worked. A woman with a silver rosary was less likely to be accused than a woman with a ribbon of thread. A man who donated a bell to the church was less likely to be questioned than a man who sang alone in the fields. A family who paid for stained glass in the chapel was less likely to be whispered about than one whose windows remained bare. Faith was not the issue. It was visibility. Righteousness, in this world, was a performance. And those with wealth understood the importance of the stage. They attended Mass, prominently in the front. They crossed themselves, elaborately, with flourish. They fasted on the correct days, paid indulgences on time, lit candles for the sick even when no one asked. They built altars in the home. They kept a vial of holy water near the door. They made sure their faith could be seen, counted, measured, and, when necessary, documented. Because in a world where accusations were made with glances, defense required symbols, and no symbol was more powerful than the appearance of piety. Among the upper classes, knowledge wore different clothes. What might be called witchcraft in a cottage was called natural philosophy in a university. The difference was not in the act, but in the context. A nobleman who kept a book of planetary alignments was not suspicious. He was educated. A physician who burned rosemary to purify the air was not condemned. He was prudent. A scholar who traced symbols into the margins of a manuscript was not invoking spirits. He was merely experimenting with geometry. The line between magic and medicine, between prayer and spell, was not drawn by content, it was drawn by class. Poor women mixed herbs because their mothers had taught them. Rich men did so because Galen had written it. Both used the same plants. Both believed in heat and cold, in dryness and moisture, in balances that governed the body and the earth. But only one of them had a Latin name for it, and Latin, more than holy water, was what kept the fire away. Because language shaped perception. Because when a judge read an incantation in the hands of a peasant, he saw blasphemy. When he heard the same cadence from a monk, he saw devotion. This was the invisible architecture of power. It was not enough to be innocent. One had to appear authorized. And so the wealthy found ways to frame their rituals, those old customs inherited from grandmothers and wet nurses, as part of a higher tradition. They called them humoral theory. They called them temperaments. They explained their symbols with references to Aristotle. They placed their jars and stones and dried plants in cabinets of curiosity, besides seashells and ink drawings, and no one thought to question it. Because it looked like science. Because it was arranged. Because it did not smell like fear. That was the true difference. Poor magic was desperate. Hidden in chimneys. Sealed in bottles. It smelled like sweat and scorched milk. Rich magic wore robes. It was debated in salons. It came with margins and footnotes. And when the fire came, it burned the cottage first. The castle, as always, watched from a distance. It did not intervene. It did not speak. But it kept its books dry.